Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar where we'll be exploring how to future-proof your business within an increasingly regulated STR market. It's obviously a very timely and important topic, so there is plenty to unpack, and thank you all for joining us. So my name's Priya and I'm going to be your host for today. I'm also the new editor of Short-Term Rentals. If you are unfamiliar with short-term rentals, we are an online multimedia B2B publication covering the short-term rental sector as part of international hospitality media. So our webinar today is sponsored by PriceLabs. PriceLabs is a revenue management solution for vacation and short-term rentals. And here is a quick video just explaining a little bit more about what they do.
Are you ready to supercharge your vacation rental business? Meet PriceLabs, the game changer in revenue management. Our cutting-edge hyper-local pulse algorithm analyzes market trends, local events, competitor pricing, and your occupancy to optimize your rates in real time. Say goodbye to changing prices manually, and hello to maximum occupancy. There's no way to be competitive or successful without dynamic pricing. Pricing and forgetting just doesn't work if you want consistent bookings. With PriceLabs, you're in control. Customize settings to match your unique property and market. PriceLabs seamlessly integrates with over 150 property management systems and channel managers and provides 24/7 multilingual support. Don't leave money on the table. Join more than 50,000 successful hosts and revolutionize your revenue management with PriceLabs today.
Further details about PriceLabs is available via the links in the chat box below if you would like to learn more. So moving on, here's just a quick overview of our webinar format for today. So we're going to start with a 45-minute to 50-minute discussion with our panel, followed by time for a Q&A at the end. So please feel free to pop any questions that you might have into the chat box at the bottom of your screen as we go along. This session is also being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to your email box within the next 24 hours. So we have a great panel of speakers joining us here today, and I'm going to allow them each to introduce themselves, starting from left to right, as you can see on your screen. So let's start with you, Tiffany. Welcome. How are we doing, Tiffany?
Wonderful. I'm so excited to join y'all today. So my name is Tiffany Edwards. I was born and raised in the vacation short-term rental industry, based out of the state of Florida, but have consulted all over the country. My husband and I manage and operate vacation rentals throughout the country, but focus mainly on the consulting and advocacy side with Khaira Consulting.
Great. Thank you, Tiffany. And if we move on to you, Boris, welcome.
Thank you, Priya. Hi, everyone. My name is Boris Pavlov. I'm based out of Bulgaria, former large-scale property manager up until last year. Currently working on Photoway, which is a solution to enable property managers to become less dependent on OTAs. I've also done quite a lot of policy work as the president of the Bulgarian Short-Term Rental Association, which is also part of the European Holiday Homes Association. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Boris, for that. And if we move on to you, Manuel.
Hi, my name is Manuel Lozano. I'm the founder of Expo Renta Vacacional, which is an event for property managers and professional hosts in Mexico, and also founder of the Vacation Rental Management Association for Mexico for property managers.
Thank you, Manuel. And on to you, Sean.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Priya. Hello, everybody from sunny, beautiful Barcelona. My name is Sean Shirazian. I'm the CEO of Lodgify. If you don't know Lodgify, it is a software that helps host and small-scale property managers get started and grow their rental business.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sean. And all of the LinkedIn information from our panelists will be available in the chat. So if you are interested in connecting further, please take a look there. So moving on, let's kick things off with a little bit of context. So I've pulled together a few recent headlines on stories that we've covered recently on short-term rentals, just to give us a little overview of our discussion for today. So as you can see here, governments around the world are taking steps to regulate or attempt to regulate the short-term rental market. So most recently, we've seen large-scale protests in Spain in response to the housing crisis, where short-term rentals were cited as a significant contributing factor to housing shortages for local residents. We've also seen a reduction in annual renting limits, like in Amsterdam, as well as the introduction of registries, as seen in British Columbia here, in attempt to regulate the market. If we move on to our next slide, we can see that in London, there was a proposal as well to introduce new levies on short-term lets, signalling that councils are perhaps looking for ways to control the sector and manage its local impact. In Lisbon, we've seen a more firmer stance with a ban on new short-term rentals taking place in key areas, aimed at freeing up houses for residents. While in Marseille, a recent crackdown on STR sparked a wave of property sell-offs, as some landlords were seen as pulling back from the market entirely. So all of these examples together kind of show us that there is increasing pressure and pushback, and they raise key questions about how STR operators can adapt and stay ahead, which is exactly what we will be exploring today. So let's talk about it. So to kick things off, I kind of want to start with an overview of how STR regulations have kind of shifted in the past year. So Boris, if we start with you, how have you kind of seen regulations evolve over the past year, perhaps in particularly from your perspective in Eastern Europe and Bulgaria?
Sure. Well, my perspective is actually over all countries that are member states of the European Union, because they would all be impacted by the same type of regulation that's being enforced across all the EU member states. It's going to come into force next year in 2026. So in one of your previous slides, we saw that I believe it was British Columbia, that was introducing a registration scheme. Well, it's going to be something similar now in Europe. We already have that in Bulgaria. Some member states already have it. There will be a licensing regime or a registration scheme. It's more or less the same thing, where every single property needs to obtain a license. Now, the member states are allowed to determine the rules, how you can obtain this license. They would be allowed to also restrict the number of licenses, I believe. But essentially, every EU member state will have a unified registration system to register all short-term rentals, and it will have a mechanism via which the platforms will be removing every single non-registered rental directly from the platform. So this is a regulation that has been discussed and agreed upon between the European Commission and the major OTAs, which will regulate to a large extent the gray area of the business, the hosts who are not compliant with any regulations. So that's going to at least put some compliance, but then each member state will be able to individually decide on certain limits, unfortunately, as we've seen happening in countries like Spain, Italy as well. There's quite a lot of setbacks. Slovenia has had some setbacks recently. So a lot is changing. And the first thing you need to do as a property manager, I guess, is to stay informed about all these changes.
Thank you for that, Boris. And Tiffany, is there anything from a kind of US context that has been particularly notable for you, maybe over the past year or so?
Yeah, so to piggyback a little bit on what Boris was saying, we've experienced the registration over the last several years, really as a result of COVID. So it was very mixed throughout the country of the US, where Some of our markets had registration and licensing requirements, but not all. So there was a mad dash for registration. And what we're seeing now in the last year is a slowdown and a revisit of those registration regulations. Really reviewing, do those operations work? Do the applications work? How many MOUs are being placed with the OTA, so agreements where there is accountability of any illegal activity and finding any of those illegal listings and removing them. We also had a very large push for bans and for caps based on these registrations, and those have significantly slowed down. More specifically, in the last year, we've seen a lot of wins on the litigation side. So for ordinances that had really restrictive regulations and application or registration processes or bans, they have now fallen and the courts. And so these local areas are now having to draft new ordinances to create better compliance.
Interesting. Thank you for that, Tiffany. And Sean, I kind of wanted to ask yourself, what kind of regulatory shifts are standing out to you, maybe from the operators that you work with globally?
Yeah, I think definitely one of the big themes that we see is this shift from really kind of like the early adopters as far as cities adopting regulation and restrictions in the first place to now it being much more mainstream, and that those regulations are even becoming tighter and tighter as well overall. And so I think we're seeing this as you just showed in all those news clips, right? This has become mainstream, whereas a couple of years ago, this was like, New York. I remember when the ban came out in New York, that was like the one city you could point to, one of a few handful of cities that was doing something like that. Now it's every day. Now it's happening here in Barcelona. It's happening all around. So it's gone from this, like, it was the early adopter cities and regions to now it's pretty much across the board. And I think one of the watch outs for that is as this has become more mainstream, more and more cities are wanting to kind of follow the trend, and they may be moving to be too reactive and to kind of follow what others are doing without being as data backed as they should be, and actually thinking about, hey, what did work in New York? What didn't work there? How does that impact how we think about regulation for our city or our region? So it's so important, I think, now that we're much more data backed about this and learn from those early adopters that have gone before these cities the last few years.
Definitely. I think also as STRs have kind of boomed as an industry, I guess we're seeing countries follow with their regulations without really examining what needs to be done, what changes need to be made. So kind of on that, circling back to you, Tiffany, you're kind of, when you're advising, say, STR companies and working with local government, what's a change that you feel has kind of surprised you, you'd say, recently?
So one of the things, that's a great question. One of the things that we've really been looked at in the last couple of years is, outside of, the bans, is this constant narrative of a commercial categorization as opposed to that residential. And so having that tone allows the ability, to zone out for the US, to use the vacation rentals in those homes. I've now seen a lot of regulation specifically requiring business type licenses, definitions of commercial use. And what that does is it opens us up to all types of different taxing, different inspection modalities. And so that has been really surprising. The registration as well, requiring that individuals, the homes and the properties have to be owned by individuals as opposed to limited liability corporations, which most people do for a second home. That has gained a lot of attention and been very fast to the market in making those changes. And I think that opens us up overall to a lot more regulation and concern in the future.
Definitely. Yes. And Manuel, kind of hopping on that, are there any shifts that you've notably seen maybe in Latin America that have particularly stood out to you or surprised you over the past year?
Yeah, I mean, just to give you a little bit of background on what is happening in Latin America and how certain governments have been adopting certain regulations from abroad. So the two key markets, which is Mexico and Brazil, they have been in a way targeted in the last year, I would say, with one particular regulation, and specifically in Mexico. Brazil, Colombia and Ecuador, they have a very friendly approach by the government in terms of regulations, as far as I know. And in Brazil are beginning to regulate certain markets. They're beginning to see how that was gonna pan out. In particular, in Mexico, what is happening is that last year they came up because authorities can come up with very wild ideas, but in particular in Mexico City, that was the first big regulation that it was launched. And basically, for Mexico City, which is the highest night producer for short-term rental in Latin America. One of the things that they did is that you're allowed to do vacation rental or short-term rental as long as you comply with these three things. The first one is that you need to register, which is really no big deal. You know, basically you need to register your properties in a website. Then the second one is that you are allowed to do to do vacation rental with the first, the second, and the third property. After the fourth one, you need to register as a commercial entity, and that's when the problem comes. So that's another issue for us. And then the third one, which was basically introduced very late in the game after the first law was approved, is a third restriction, which is basically says you are allowed to do vacation rental or short-term rental, but with a limit of 50% capacity or occupancy. If we put this together, the three of them, it's really a mess because it's, first of all, it's difficult to track, it's difficult to comply, and it's difficult to even to think that this is even legal. So right now, the current situation in Mexico City is basically that we're in a standstill. I thought in a way that some of the vacation rental inventory was going to drop beginning of this year, but we haven't seen that. So vacation rental inventory in Mexico City is pretty much the same as it was last year. The website is not there. So they have put together all these regulations, but it's very difficult for the proper authorities to actually even to track it and to implement this. And that's what we're beginning to see as a big failure in policy, because if they want to create regulations and they're putting more than they can chew, it's going to be very difficult for them to track everything, and people simply are going to be very disencouraged to become a regulated property. So that's basically where we are in Mexico City.
Thank you for that, Manuel. And kind of speaking on how things can kind of get lost in translation in that sense. Sean, how do you think that regulators may often misunderstand, or what do you think they may often misunderstand about the STR industry?
I think like I have a ton of empathy for anybody that's in those shoes, right? Because the housing crisis and the affordability of housing has gotten crazy. So there's no question about that. And if you're one of the regulators looking at this from a city standpoint, you're concerned about this. And you're kind of looking at all levers that you have to try to get this under control for your population, for your public. And so on the one hand, I have like a ton of empathy for what they have to grapple with. And in that situation, I think the thing that we can all come together and help with is data. One report I was reading recently from It was a state of short-term rentals in 2024 from Rent Responsibly. And they interviewed different constituents in the space. And they interviewed policymakers in the survey, and they said, what would you need most help? Where do you need the most help? And I think it was 82% of them said access to data, access to reliable data on, how many short-term rentals are in my city? What's the, flow of tourists that we have coming to stay at them, and these sorts of things. And then on the flip side, they also surveyed short-term rental operators. And more than half of them were saying, "Hey, we're willing to work with the policymakers to figure out data-backed and data-driven frameworks here." And so the great news is like both sides want to collaborate more. Both sides want to cooperate more to find data-driven solutions that actually solve the root cause of this problem. And so that's great. That's a great first step. Now we need to kind of take that open door invitation and sit at the table with the right folks to get to more data-backed and data-driven policies that are actually going to solve the problem. And again, learn from cities that have been the early adopters and what has worked and what hasn't worked.
Definitely. And I guess on that, do you think that better data can kind of help governments strike that balance between tourism growth and housing access? Because obviously through being data-led, as you mentioned before, instead of kind of just copying regulations as they occur, across the globe, having a more data-backed approach could really help tackle that strategically.
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. One story, just quick story related to that. I heard from a customer of ours recently, Herbert, who's in Southern California. The municipality that he's in has banned short-term rentals. And so he's had to convert his short-term rental to a medium-term rental. And the rationale for banning them, one of the main pieces of rationale was due to the noise complaints that apparently had come in from short-term rentals. And it was noted that there were 1,500 noise complaints in a year related to that. And Herbert was a very analytical detective profile. And he's like, I'm going to look into this. So he literally looked through all 1,500 complaints in his municipality to understand were these noise complaints and were they really related to short-term rentals? Of the 1,500 noise complaints, only one of them was related to short-term rentals. But in the in the kind of the sense of urgency that policymakers had, and given the data at a high level that they were seeing, they kind of put this all on short-term rental and put all of the blame and all of the restrictions on that. When in reality, if you were just to look at that data a little bit more closely, you would have come to a different outcome.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Sean. And kind of moving on here slightly, how are changing regulations kind of affecting investor confidence or expansion plans? Boris, are you seeing stricter regulations impact where operators or investors are willing to expand?
Yeah, in fact, I've had a few of the property managers that we're working with, had them reach out and ask or share that they're going to be moving to a different market. And consider this, they're moving to a different country because their business is in jeopardy at the country where they're currently residing. I just want to reiterate what Sean said about data. And actually, that's the most important thing about regulation, because data is what's going to close the gap between the operators in the space and the policymakers. That's the missing piece. And hopefully with this new regulation coming live next year in Europe, we'll see that gap closing. But data is also equally important when it comes to investment. And I mean, any investor is basing their investment thesis on the data available for a particular market. And I'm sure they're pricing in a risk factor, and that risk factor is in all cases regulation. So how likely it is in the next couple of years down the line to have a regulation that would severely restrict short-term rentals and thus not prevent the investor from getting the necessary yield. And that's also something that policymakers need to take into account. Now, in some markets where you have over tourism, and this is not the majority of markets in Europe. I mean, yes, there is Barcelona, there's a few cities and resorts like that, but over tourism is not a pan-European problem that Europe has to fight with, not at all. There's a lot of markets where it's quite the opposite. So in that sense, policymakers need to take into account also the pure impact that short-term rentals have on the local economy, not just the impact generated by guests that are visiting the city and that are choosing to stay at a short-term rental, but also the impact of the investors that are investing in either real estate property or property management companies, creating new jobs. That's very important. I kind of feel like those things are being neglected by the majority of policymakers, while at the same time, short-term rentals are used sort of as a scapegoat. Whenever there is a housing crisis, put the blame on short-term rentals. Whenever there are noise complaints, as Sean was just saying, yeah, just put the blame on short-term rentals and, do something which is kind of easy. And one thing that's super important, how we as property managers can, react to that, join associations, local associations, join forces, and try to have a common sort of governing body on the business side to work with the policymakers and to make sure that whatever the policymakers do does not impact negatively the entire economy of the given city or resort.
Yes, thank you for that, Boris. And kind of just following on for what you mentioned there, do you think that self-regulation is realistic, or should kind of co-regulation be the goal when it comes to what you've experienced in your policy work?
Self-regulation, I don't think it would be the way to go, unfortunately, because this short-term rentals industries has very low barrier to entry, so anyone can participate, and it's easy for a bad actor to join in and participate. So self-regulation wouldn't work. We need dialogue. We need to fill in the gap between us as a business, as an industry, and the policymakers, and make sure we have a regulation that's working for everybody, but enforced by the government or some sort of a higher body, because I don't think we'll be able to handle this on our own.
And Manuel, if I could bring you in here on this conversation, from your point of view, how are local governments kind of engaging with STR platforms, and what's your kind of take on that?
Well, I think it's definitely very important. As I totally agree with Sean in terms of data, and with Boris about that engagement. And associations have to be creative. So in other words, if you're a property manager, it's going to be very difficult for you to engage directly with the with authorities. You need a body, a representation, a legal entity that could engage. So that's the reason why Boris is saying you need to join an association. But then after you're working with an association, your association needs to be very, very creative on how to approach certain issues. Because then you have the gentrification, as Sean was saying, you have pressure from hotels, you have many other things that you need to kind of sort out. But the only way for us really to send the message across is engaging. And you need to engage in a way where you know that they're going to put attention to it. So you need to focus on taxes and revenue, how much business is coming to the industry on the side, and for additional industries like the restaurants or any other service that could be benefiting from this industry. And also, and I think very important that a lot of people that I have seen in some other countries like left aside is basically the real estate industry, because the real estate industry moves by investment. That's really where the investment comes. And if you think about property taxes, and if you think about the taxes on a transaction, a single transaction on buying a real estate, That's very important. That adds up a lot of money for revenue. So that is very important that associations also reach realtors associations, because in this particular case, for instance, in the case of Mexico, what is happening is that if these laws pass in some other cities, they definitely going to diminish a lot the possibility of buying properties. And in certain areas of Mexico, buying properties is a very strong business, right? And as a second homes. So that's where we're pressuring. That's where we know we have figured out a way where they know that that is the Achilles heels, and that we just go after that one and tell, hey, listen, if you regulate this in this matter, you're gonna make all this industry, which is the real estate industry, just go down, and that means taxes, and that means property taxes, and that's going to be a huge hit, in addition to some other things. My recommendation is to go after certain things that you know that where the government is going to put attention, because sometimes they just don't simply by knocking the door and saying, hey, you know, I'm an association. They don't want to hear it. And you need to find out exactly where they will put attention and go after that goal.
Thank you for that, Manuel. And kind of on the flip side there, Tiffany, if you could offer a piece of advice to, say, policymakers, what would that piece of advice be?
So one thing, because again, I agree with all the comments that have just been made, and I do think the associations and the alliances are really important, but I think even more important of that is knowing the identity of who that alliance and that association is. Mm-hmm. So always putting forth that you're the educated professional on this matter and that you're the trusted individual. So providing that data over and over and proactively is really important. And I think having these conversations with the elected officials of how do these policies affect operations so that they are enforceable. The other side too is that there is a cause and effect. So understanding, again, how much economic revenue there is, but if the loss of that or the ban of that or over regulations to this industry, what is the deficit that brings to that local area? And so trying to string that together for those elected officials is extremely important, because they're going to have to find those answers somewhere else. And I will add in terms of the data, we've had some real success. Key Data has provided us data specifically on listings, and we've used it to a map. So just as much as you have data, you have to know exactly how you present it. So something really easy for people and elected officials and staff to be able to understand a map with all those listings so they can show where the congestion is really important. We've also worked with another research company through our DMO that's created a model of use of days and use of services. So as tourism or guests come to the area, what are the uses and strain on the area by the county or city that they have to provide? But in turn, also how much is the revenue they're generating? And so how does that off balance? And that's been one of our most successful studies and data that we've been able to provide for our elected officials.
Thank you, Tiffany. Yeah, it's really, really interesting to see how data can actually be used to kind of help shape more balanced policies as well. So that's really interesting. And Sean, in your point of view, how can platforms like Lodgify maybe help clients manage local compliance, especially when they might be operating in, say, multiple cities or regions, for example?
Yeah, sure. It goes back to a point I believe Boris was shared earlier, right? It's first step is awareness, first step is education, and then second step is action. And one of the things that we provide at Lodgify is a number of resources, our blog, webinars with experts. We do these types of events, in addition to a monthly newsletter we call Lodgify Lowdown, which shares out this information as far as what's changing in cities and regions all around the world. We've got hundreds of thousands of folks across the Logify community, customers and non-customers, that subscribe to that just to hear the latest. And look, there's other sources of that out there. And so what I'd recommend is find a source that you trust, find a source that's reliable, that can help you stay on top of what's changing in the space, because it can feel overwhelming, so that you can accomplish that first step of having the awareness. And then that can lead you to figuring out what you're going to do about it as far as the action.
Thank you. And that kind of leads me on to my next question, which is kind of, when those local rules are unclear, what kind of support do you think that hosts might need to look for, or should look for and prioritize?
I think this is where, really leaning on their local representatives of the city that they're in to one, make it clear that whatever the regulation is or restriction is, that it isn't clear to follow, and more work needs to be done there. But ultimately, these in a lot of cases are elected officials that are there to kind of represent the public's interest. And so if things aren't clear and things aren't working for this sector of the city, then be loud about that. The squeaky wheel gets the oil or the grease, right? And so you have to kind of make your concerns and any of these things that aren't working clear to the policymakers.
Definitely. And to Tiffany, how do you kind of recommend to guide hosts who are struggling with conflicting or maybe incomplete guidance from their local authorities?
Yeah, I think a lot of us get intimidated, one, by the verbiage, and two, how to implement that. And I have found in most local areas within the US that whatever department it is in, there's usually an individual who will take the time to go through and explain a lot of that. Most of this, whether it's an elected official or a staff member or a state department, you really need to build a relationship with an individual. Have that relationship as opposed to just sending emails in, to ask and to ascertain what exactly the policy is requesting. And then the other part is then, how do you operationally within your system comply with that? That's going to be, and I think that we'll see, now and moving forward, like we've seen in the US, you'll see ordinances or laws start to change because the operations don't necessarily make sense. And so if it doesn't, for those operators, they again need to be the squeaky wheel and say exactly why it doesn't make sense, and then be prepared to present a solution as to why, what would work better for that rental.
And ahead of kind of when in places where regulation seems to be quite volatile, what's one step that you would recommend maybe to an operator who wants to be prepared before new regulations hit?
One of the easiest things to do is to make sure that they are signed up or registered for any agenda. In the US, you have the ability to put your email address on in the county or city system or a state, and they'll send you notifications of all the agendas. So making sure that you read that to see if you will be talked about, or sometimes if you're on the minutes and short-term rentals are referenced. I think that's extremely important. I will always say number one is to build up relationships with elected officials and with staff members. So that's your land planning, that's the department where your licensing or registration is, that's your county or city attorney. Having that relationship is number one. And I think as well, going back into those local alliances or groups or associations, knowing who those stakeholders are in your community that operate similar to you and that have the same non-negotiables for what your language should be or how you would operate, and knowing who those individuals are, so that if and when a regulation does come up, you all are together and united to speak on its behalf.
Great, thank you for that, Tiffany. And kind of want to get a little bit into the best ways to maybe advocate for fairer rules, especially in maybe emerging or smaller markets. So Manuel, in your opinion, what has worked well, and what have you seen that has worked well when it comes to engaging with governments and advocating for workable rules?
So I think what I have kind of learned in my job is that typically the authorities, the local government, elected government, in some cases, until recently, I should say, they were not aware about this problem, about the gentrification, that they are, of course, blaming the short-term rental, or different things about short-term rentals that people beginning to dislike. So they've been there, or they have approached some sort of strong opinion regarding short-term rental, because we have not done our job correctly. I mean, I don't think we as an association or any other association has even the resources to come up with a very strong message and to advocate in a right way, because we just simply are just running our business, and right now we're in a stage where all of a sudden we begin to see that the government wants to regulate us. So the best way, I think, moving forward is to not to be afraid of engaging with them, and just basically approach them and just pick up the phones. One of the things that I love, for instance, in the US and Mexico, is that you have your phones and emails from different authorities, and you can basically email them and call them. The other day, actually, I approached one of them, just pick up the phone and give him a call. And of course, they were afraid about answering the phone. Actually, I have one congressman who actually picked up the phone. And my reaction initially I thought that they were very against it and everything. And one thing moved to the next one. And they were, they were open the doors to have some dialogue and to chat about the issues. And I would say, the very first thing is to gather information and have the intention and the resolution of approaching an authority, and just basically say, hey, listen, this is where we are. These are the issues. We need to come with a solution. And just basically explain your point of view or your view on things, rather than not do it. Because while not doing that, I mean, the option is that someone else in some other industry, basically the hotel industry, they're going to do exactly the same, and they're gonna give them their point of view. So they need to have both points of views, and they need to have any other point of view from on the benefits on what's happening with short-term rental. So my suggestion initially is that again, the best approach is through an association, and work with the association, and even you pick up the phone and give them a call, and try to set up appointments where you begin that conversation. And I think that's the key thing. And then, as long as you do that, then the same conversation is gonna guide you on, especially in markets where we are not very regulated and we're just beginning. Of course, I understand that there's certain markets like European and the US markets, which are very, very mature and very, very regulated. But I think the approach, it would be pretty much the same. The first thing is to contact the authorities.
Priya, can I add one thing to that?
Of course, yeah.
So I would also suggest, I think that's such valuable advice. The one thing I would say is that always leave behind. So it's a one-pager with any information you feel that elected official particularly would find of interest about the industry, and then all your contact information so that they have it or the staff has it. So then that's just a visual for them to run down what maybe you've spoken about, but also that you're the educated insight into the industry. And then the other thing I would suggest is that if you ever have a one-on-one meeting with any of these elected officials or staff, is to write a handwritten thank you note afterwards. You build such a great relationship with those individuals.
Thank you both for that. Some really useful points there. And circling to you, Boris, have you seen any maybe successful examples of industry associations working with regulators to create a more balanced policy?
Well, with a successful outcome, yes. Our association managed to prevent the ban of short-term rentals in Bulgaria not once but twice. And right now we have a very good dialogue with the local authorities. So there are good examples. I can't say necessarily that it was easy or that it was very pleasant, especially the first time around. So, the point is we can try to do everything in our power to do something, but if the policymakers are really set on banning, they will ban. So one thing that I think we haven't covered, but it's quite important, is a doomsday scenario. Imagine short-term rentals are completely banned in your market. What do you do? And my advice to that would be prepare and diversify. Diversify the services that you offer to homeowners because you already have the infrastructure to operate any rental, not just a short-term rental. Actually, operating short-term rentals is a lot more difficult than managing long-term rentals. And long-term rental management is something that, there are clients for that, there are customers for that, and you could definitely expand into a different business vertical. You could also expand your business in other ways. There are referral networks out there that you can use your existing traveler customer base and monetize that, not necessarily in your own properties that you're managing, because in that doomsday scenario, they're banned. You can't really use them, but you can host these guests in different locations around the world. That's what we're doing. And again, there's a few referral networks out there in the space that you can take advantage of and just get an additional revenue stream so that if the government pulls the plug on short-term rentals, you can still survive as a business. So we need to think about that scenario as well. We cannot be hoping that everything's going to fall into place and then we'll be able to continue operating. So I just wanted to add that. There are great examples out there. There's also exceptions like New York City and places where it's impossible to perform this business anymore. Hopefully it's not going to come to that in many other locations.
Thank you for that, Boris. And kind of on that, in terms of future-proofing, integrating well into local communities is also one way that STR operators can kind of enhance their reputation in their local communities and which can help them protect themselves against increasing regulations. So Tiffany, is this something that you've seen operators doing well potentially in the US, or is this something that you think there's still scope to explore?
I think there's always opportunity to explore and strengthen some of those relationships. I do think that the integration, we've done a really great job in specific markets that are tourism, heavy and economic reliant on utilizing partners within the community. So through AI, for a lot of our operations, we've been able to add in recreation, restaurant and purchases through our reservation system, integrating that. We also have been able to talk through the housekeeping and that we pay more than necessarily hotels. And so what that effect has on the local community, communicating that we've done a much better job of, but I think there's always an opportunity more to talk about the reliance and the partnership of the short-term rental industry within these markets. And I would also say too, that knowing and dialing into the market. So knowing that if it's, short-term rental heavy, or if it's hotel heavy, how do you identify how you're integrating with the community, either better than the hotels and being able to share that without the elected officials.
Definitely. And Manuel, obviously in the work that you do you kind of think that hosts do have a role to play in addressing those issues and concerns that are apparent in local communities when it comes to building trust locally and also using that to future-proof?
Yes, I definitely do. And as a matter of fact, I can tell you, for instance, in this particular case that I was mentioning in the one in Mexico City, for instance, just because of the simple fact that new regulations came along, they have been started to place, there's some other associations who have been started, not only associations, but also movement of people like just regular Airbnb hosts, basically joining together forces and approaching the government. And that what gives them is a huge voice, and very important, by the way, because these I would say hosts, which are probably one who has 1, 2, or even 3 properties, which they are, I would say, probably 75% of the market, or yeah, I mean, close to 80% of the market. It's a lot of people. And when a lot of people begins to engage with the government, you know, that's when the government begins to listen. That's the reason why, again, that you need to, you know, join with an association. But definitely, you need to engage with the government in that matter, with in a way helping also small property owners or small hosts to even join an association, or you know, let them know that they can create their own movement or association towards the to get more information and present themselves with the local government.
Definitely. Thank you. And just before we kind of move on to see any potential questions from our listeners, I'd like to ask each of you in one sentence, what's your best kind of piece of advice that you would give to STR businesses that are trying to stay ahead in a more regulated market? So Tiffany, if we start with you.
First, it would be to make sure that you are in compliance with any of the current regulations. And then second would be to make sure that you have a relationship with elected officials and staff and building in that. That's by far most important.
Thank you, Tiffany. And to you, Boris, any piece of advice that you would give to businesses trying to stay ahead?
Yeah. First, join an association, and second, diversify, add new revenue streams so that you're prepared.
Thank you, Boris. And on to you, Manuel.
Yes, my suggestion would be, first of all, if you're in this market and if your business is in short-term rental, you need to join an association. Secondly, definitely you need to find out if you're in compliance, just like Tiffany was saying. And then the third question I would say is, if I'm in compliance, and is this a good business? Because this is the other thing. You don't want to be in a market where it's you know, whatever regulation it is, and then eventually you realize it's not a good business, then probably move to another one. So join an association, you know, do your compliance, know if you're in compliance with everything, and realize if this is a good business for you or not. When I'm saying a good business, I mean in that particular market. And if it's not, then probably just try to diversify to some other markets.
Good advice there. Thank you, Manuel. And lastly, to you, Sean.
Yeah, shameless plug here, but sign up for the Logify blog and you'll get a monthly newsletter that shares updates on what's going on all around the world as far as regulation and compliance. And you can always do that with your local city council as well. But that way you've got you know, pulse on what's going on not only in your city but all around the world, and what's going on in your backyard.
Thanks all. It's clear that obviously regulations are growing more complex, but obviously there is hopefully hope that we can see things move in a more positive direction. So thank you all for all of your insights. I'm just going to move on quickly here to some audience questions. So we've got a comment here about changes in Marbella. One listener has commented that they are seeing buildings and urbanizations stopping holiday rentals, and they're seeing a decrease in real estate value. Would anybody like to comment on the kind of impact on real estate value with the increasing regulations, potentially in other markets as well?
Well, I mean, I'm not surprised at all. We can expect that real estate value is going to drop if we're talking about investment real estate, and when we're talking about resorts and more seasonal locations, usually people are buying as an investment in a second home. So if they cannot rent it out on a short-term basis, that's a huge chunk of potential revenue that just goes down the drain. So what Daniela is seeing, Sean, that's one of your clients, I believe. What Daniela is seeing is completely normal, and I expect it to happen in any location where you have these bans. Real estate prices of suitable buildings are just going to drop.
Yeah,
Thank you.
we've seen that in Palm Springs as well, California, when they had pretty significant bans and limitations and caps of how many permits that they were able to receive. While that is out there, it is something else that we have to communicate, because if affordable housing continues to be a concern and issue, which it will, really, making sure that we're not saying that we're driving up all of the pricing. That is mostly these homes are, not affordable homes to begin with, and they're in markets that are desirable markets that people would like to have a second home, but need to be able to rent to afford the mortgage on those. And so it's 100% true. We've seen it in other marketplaces in the US that will affect the real estate value. It'll also affect the property taxes that come in. But more importantly, it's just how we communicate it, so we're not leading the charge saying that we're the affordable housing issue.
Thank you for that, Tiffany. And we've got another question here just about the changes in the Ugandan network of businesses. We've got a question asking, might any of the speakers know of any possible collaborators the Ugandan network of businesses could work with to overcome regulatory issues?
Not sure. I believe there's going to be like a global short-term rental association, but yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that, if any of you guys can.
I don't know, but I would imagine that it probably is a market that is not just yet very regulated, perhaps. I would imagine, I'm not quite sure. And if that's the case, countries and cities and that are in that regard, they probably especially in developing countries, they need them as much as investment as possible. So putting the brakes on vacation rental, it definitely hurts the real estate industry. So I would imagine that would be the case. But my suggestion in that case is pretty much like Tiffany and Boris was saying. I mean, definitely it will hurt the industry. We in Mexico, we have seen it, and just by knowing that government is making certain type of putting together certain ideas about regulation, definitely disencourage a lot investment, and the investment is really on second property houses. So again, join the association, see if you're in compliance, see if this is a good business, and repeat.
Right. Thank you for that, Manuel. And on that note, I'm going to wrap things up here. So just a big final thank you to Tiffany, Sean, Manuel, and Boris for all of your insights today. I just have a few things. There's just a few things from me before we say goodbye. So just move on to the next slide. So we will be hosting another webinar in a few weeks' time on using the latest technology to provide the best guest experience. If you are interested in learning more, then please sign up via the link that will be in the chat box in just a moment. And if you are interested in working with us, then please reach out to our head of growth, whose contact details are on screen now. And again, just one last thank you to our speakers and to our listeners. And I hope that you could all take something away from our session today. And here is a closing video about the team at International Hospitality Media, just to wrap things up.
Hello, we are International Hospitality Media, or IHM for short. IHM is the #1 brand to engage with decision makers in hospitality and real estate. Our 4 multimedia brands lead their respective sectors with breaking news, comments, trends, and opinions across a variety of multimedia solutions. We provide an inspirational community to connect people through world-class events, webinars, podcasts, award schemes, and much more. But let us share our story of who we are and what we do. Over 10 years ago, Piers and George had a light bulb moment to provide expert opinion, comments, and low-cost digital content. And so, they went on a journey over the past decade, creating media platforms to serve the hospitality and real estate industries. We now have an engaged audience with a reach of over 60,000 monthly visitors across our website, 52,500 in our email database across all sectors, and over 68,000 across our social channels. Everything we do challenges the status quo. We believe in thinking differently. We make things simple and very easy to work with us, and we're a friendly bunch too. We offer creative solutions to help you achieve your business goals. Read, watch, listen, and meet with IHM. Connect with us for a chat today. Just look at some of the brands we have worked with recently.